Hey, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. And if you're watching this on Patreon, to my Patreon channel. Today, we're going to be starting a series of Masterworks reviews where what we'll do is we'll put up a very famous or maybe not so famous work of art from a painting master of the past. And we're going to pick apart the art as much as we can and learn from it as much as we can. Now, the reason I love to do this is it's so amazing to learn from others, but most of the other artists that I like have, long since left this planet. And so what we have left are their amazing pieces of art. So what we'll do in this series is to look through some of these masterworks and kind of tease out what they did and maybe even a little bit how they did it, just as a way for you to learn from that. The reason I like to do this is back when I was in art school at the American Academy of Art in Chicago, during my lunch breaks, and even in some of the afternoons after school, a bunch of friends of mine and I would go over to the art museum across the street, which is called the Art Institute. And we'd just go in there and look around and basically focus on one or two masterworks that day and just tease those apart. I remember some of my favorite ones were looking at the French Impressionist exhibit, and a lot of John Singer Sargent's work was there as well. So, what I loved about that was we got to discuss the art and try to figure out again how they did it, why they did it, what worked, what didn't work, and maybe come away with things that we could try in our own works. So, that's what we're going to be doing in this series. Now, this is going to be a very limited series on my YouTube channel. So if you want all of the Masterworks reviews in this series, please go to my Patreon channel. That's where all of them will be available to paid subscribers of all levels. On YouTube, I'll do a few of these, but again, the vast majority of them will be on my Patreon site. And that way you'll be able to follow along with each one of these that I do. So this week we are going to review this painting by Mary Cassatt. Now, if you don't know her, Mary Cassatt was a very, very famous woman American artist in the late 1800s and very early part of the 1900s. She was the only American ever to exhibit with the French Impressionists in Paris. So during the time the French Impressionists were actively displaying their artwork in salons and shows, she was the only one invited to show with them who was not French. She hung out with folks like Edgar Degas, and they learned from each other. And that's what I loved about their stories. We'll talk about Degas next time. But with Mary, she was actually born into a fairly well-off family. And back in the day, her father didn't want her to pursue art. Back then women weren't really expected or even allowed in some cases to have careers of their own. She was actually just expected to be a wife and a mother and married off to someone who would be a good match for the family. But, Mary had other plans and she wanted to study art. Well, her parents decided that they were not going to pay for that. And so she found a way to do that on her own. Her whole story is really amazing. I'm not going to get into that here. Really, what I want to focus on is this one painting. But eventually, she did find her way to France, again, on her own money, on her own dime. Her parents didn't pay for that. And she began painting and exhibited in one of the Paris salons in the late 1800s, where Edgar Degas found her work. He loved her work and invited her to show with he and his buddies, who we now know as the French Impressionists. And she jumped on the chance because for her, it was a way to learn again from peers. Good peers in the art world learned from each other. That's really how we keep improving. That's why I like to do this Patreon site and also my YouTube channel so that you can learn from me. And sometimes I'll learn from my students as well. It's kind of a back and forth thing. But in this case, this was in the late 1800s. Like I said, she used to hang out with them occasionally. and she was great friends with Edgar Degas. It's not really clear whether those two were involved in a relationship. I tend to think not, but they were great friends and pushed each other to learn more and more about art and also to paint better paintings. And I know she learned a lot from him, and he regarded her very well most of the time. There's one famous story which led to the creation of this particular painting where they were hanging out with a bunch of the other French Impressionists. And he was a guy, kind of a product of his time, didn't really think that women should become artists because they just weren't really good at it. Not because they shouldn't, because they should be at home raising children. That wasn't it. It was because to him, they weren't really well suited to be artists because they just would never be good at it. And she took offense at that remark, went home and decided to create a painting that was not classically beautiful, but yet captured the attention of everybody viewing it. And that's what she did here. As you can see, this is, this particular model is not the most beautiful model in the world. And that's exactly why Mary Cassatt chose her. She's very pale skinned. You can see here she goes outdoors. She has, back then women would have worn high collars. So her face is a little bit ruddy, and we can see a little bit of a farmer's tan down here toward her wrists. But the rest of her skin is very, very white. So she kind of looks a little bit sickly to us today, but that was actually quite normal back then for women. But we can see that she's got, her teeth. She's got a little bit of a problem with her jaw. She's got an overbite. She's not the prettiest young girl around to our standards, or even to Mary's standards, which is why she actually chose this particular model. So let's take a look first at the composition here. Now, interestingly enough, this is exactly what they tell you not to do in art school, which is why I found it fascinating that she did it and she pulled it off. So the axis of this young girl is right here. It's like a third of the way. I'll draw a line here. If we draw the line down, this is the axis of this young girl. And what we can see is that it's about a third of the way over from the right-hand side of the painting. And she is looking off to the right in the direction off the painting. Now, in art school, they teach you never to do that the subject should not be looking off of the painting like that if they're off on the left-hand side, because in the viewpoint of traditional art, then this area over here on the left becomes, quote, dead area. But that's actually not what happens in this painting. As we can see, this painting is actually quite dynamic. It would work cropped. If we wanted to crop it off, somewhere over here, it would work. But at the same time, it's beautiful the way it is. There's a beautiful line coming in here. And the reason why this composition works so well is that, Mary put stuff over here. There is stuff going on over here. There's the pattern on the wallpaper. There's a little bit of a still life here behind her. Again, we've got the back of the chair, and then this, it looks like maybe it's a pipe or something going up the wall. Now, this pipe is actually quite important because that acts as an anchor to the left-hand side of this painting here. And it's really what makes this sort of off-center composition work for a portrait. Typically, what you would be told to do in art school is put her looking still in this position, looking toward the right-hand side of the painting, but her axis should be over here rather than where it is over here. That way she's looking into the painting, not out of the painting. But because Mary took some precautions here and she added this compositional element of the pipe, and even this corner of the chair helps to cement this side of the composition. Now let's look at a couple of other things. There's some interesting movement lines in this piece that I really love. There's actually two really strong ones and potentially a third. The one strong one that draws my eye in is this one here. This is a really strong lead in, and this follows her. We can follow her hand up into her braid or her hair, and then through her eyes and up to her elbow, and then kind of back again. Now that's really, really advanced stuff. I don't really talk about that too much in a lot of my paintings yet. When I do my demos, we will, because movement through a painting is exceedingly important. This is really strong one right here. There's another one right here, and then another line in over here and up the side of her dress. So what I'm talking about is there are ways that you can move the viewer's eye into the painting. And those are very, very important. A lot of beginning and even intermediate artists, they don't actually pay attention to the movement into the painting. It's very important for that viewer's eye to lead itself into the painting somehow. If none of those lead-ins were here, it would almost be a little bit more difficult to follow the movement into the painting. This is the strongest one. You can see that, you know, Mary, the painter, really wanted you to come in on this one because it's strong. The blues are dark right here. There's another white line here, but that blue, the dark blues are really pulling that eye into the painting. This line, if you notice, you can go in here and then all of a sudden she put a stroke across that line so that your eye sort of halted. It was interrupted. That line of sight is just a little bit interrupted there. So it's not the strongest one because she has worked really hard to not make it the strongest one. And then this one isn't as strong either because, again, that dark and light contrast is not available. So again, just keep in mind, you know, the viewer's eye moving through the painting. And we'll talk about these in future Masterworks reviews. So let's take a peek now at some of the other things in this painting that are pretty amazing. You know, skin color, especially skin color for a Caucasian subject, can be really challenging, especially to beginner artists. Let's take a look at this a little bit more up close. I love that the way that she has handled this neck area. Now, I am looking at this painting in a program called Pixelmator Pro. You could use something like Photoshop as well. But what I love about, you know, pieces of software like Pixelmator or Photoshop is that you can do some really interesting things with them. So if I'm going in here and I'm using an eyedropper tool, I had gone into the brush tool here, the paint tool, and now I'm clicking on the color dropper tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that, make sure it's highlighted, and then come over here and click on a color. And what you can see is that color is actually a very, very, very gray white. There's a tiny little bit of yellow in it, not a lot, but it's a very cool white. And if you're really interested in the exact color ratios, I popped into it and I'm looking at the RGB values. So it's almost even across the board, which means that it's this almost the same amount of red and green and just a tiny little bit of lesser amount of blue. And that means is that we've got a gray going on here. It's not fully, it's a little warm gray. You can see where it shows up on the color palette up here, but it is really considered a gray. Now, I love doing this because sometimes, you know, when you're looking at a painting like this, it can be a little bit challenging for newbies to pick out color in specific areas. That's why I love this color dropper tool. So I've clicked it again. Now I want to look at the shadowy kind of color over there. Now we look at that over on the right-hand side, and it's definitely a gray. It's a light gray, but again, it's definitely a gray. Again, almost even across the board. A little bit more blue. You can see it's almost even red and green with a little bit more blue in it. And it's got obviously quite a bit of white in it because it's a very light yet cool gray. So using those tools that we have available to us are really helpful, especially if you're kind of new at skin tones. And I like to just kind of go across the entire area and just see what she used. She used, again, a cool gray over here in this area by her, the side of her neck. And let's take a look at this dark here. I think that's going to end up being a really dark blue. You can see here, yes, it's a very, very dark blue, a lot darker than you would think initially. So yeah, you can use programs like that. And I think even, Apple has that available in their preview tool. So take a look and see if you can find a color selector, a color picker tool available to you. It'll really help with these areas of color where it can be hard to decipher what's going on. Now that one is this area down here, right by where her, I guess it's a chemise comes up. It's kind of a warmer gray. If you look at it, there's quite a bit more red in it and a little bit of green to kind of dull it out, and then some blue, but it's definitely a bit warmer and a little darker than this area here. Now, as long as we're here, let's look at something with edges because I think it's really interesting here. This area here, the edge of that shirt or chemise, she has really taken pains to soften the edge of that so that you don't really see it very strongly. So up here, you can see here that that edge gets a little sharper and sharper because the colors are more contrasted with each other. There's that dark blue again. But down here at the base, she's really fuzzed up that edge with the shirt. Now let's take a peek further up at the face. And when we do a close-up of the face, you can see just how unpretty this young girl is. She's beautiful for sure, but she isn't classically pretty. She does have a pretty strong overbite and very kind of a ruddy complexion. What I see with this though is this beauty of this edge right here along her chin line. It's definitely, she's using some darker and cooler paint in there. Let's just take a peek and see what that is. Again, that comes out as kind of a purpley gray. We can see that it comes into the purple color scheme, but it's still kind of in that gray zone, but it is purpley. But what we're seeing here is that the edge of that shadowy, just very gentle shadowy area is again very broken up. It's not a hard edge. It's very soft. So basically she just made sure when the paint was still wet that she softened up that area as much as possible. Now there's some, obviously as we come up further in this cheek area, the colors get more red. You can see that this is kind of a grayed down dull brick red. And as we move forward up, again, that's going to become lighter and maybe a little bit more yellow in it too, and gradually lighter and lighter until we get up to this area. So right here, this is the lightest area on the face. And she's using colors all the way through so that are similar, so they're very harmonious. Now, one interesting thing that she's done, let me zoom out for just a second. If you notice what she's done with the coolness of the arms and the neck here, is that coolness, those cool skin tones that she used, has allowed that arm to sort of fade into the background just a tiny bit, meaning it's not as important as this brilliant red color on her face. So in general, in painting, especially if you're doing like landscape work, but it works even here with portraits, the warmer colors appear to the human eye to pop forward, or they could also be considered as more important. And the cooler colors, because they're cooler, for our eyes tend to just fade into the background a little bit more. So they recede a little bit more into the background. Now that's all relative. She's done something super interesting in that the red here in the wallpaper is actually a bit more intense than the red in her cheek. It's about the same color as you see in her lips. So typically that should be competing for attention with her face. But because Mary has come in here, we can see, and really made that pattern fuzzy. There's not really any really strong, sharp edges there in the background. What is it's all fuzzy. So again, those sharper edges look kind of like this area here over on her shirt, um, and a little bit here in the hands. Those sharper edges again will be more to our eyes, seem more important, and will come forward. The fuzzy areas will be something that for our eyes again kind of fade to the background. So if you think about being outdoors in the landscape, that kind of makes sense when you look off into the distance, especially if you have something like mountains or trees way off in the distance. They tend to look a little bit fuzzy to our eyes, but stuff that's up close looks super sharp. So the artist actually can fake that in their paintings by intentionally manipulating edges like this. Here's another example. If we look at her hand here, these edges aren't super sharp, but they're a lot sharper than, this area back here in the background. So it's kind of a relative thing. It's not something that's absolute by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so another area that's got a little bit sharper edges, if you notice, is this area right here in the lips and the chin. And again, some of this other stuff is a little bit fuzzier. This is a little sharper, but then this area here is super fuzzy. It's almost in some places hard to distinguish this young girl's face from the arm behind her until we get kind of in this area where now the red of her nose is standing forward and in sharp contrast because of the color change from the arm here in the background. Now the folds, she did an amazing job on the folds here. They're quite spectacular. I'm sure this took her many, many days of rework to get this exactly right. I think a lot of people think the French Impressionists, and including Mary here, they just painted for a couple hours and they were done. But that's actually not the case with this painting. We do have records to indicate that Mary worked on this painting for several weeks. So she kept coming back to it and coming back to it. So it wasn't just a one-shot deal in a day. There was a lot of work that went into this piece. We can see if we come up close that she must have used lead white, which was the typical white that was used back then. I can tell actually by looking at the skin. I actually prefer to use lead white when I paint portraits just because it's semi-transparent. It has a beautiful look and feel. However, it is toxic and you don't want to get it on your hands. So I always use gloves when I paint with lead paint, and I'm super careful with it. I usually don't paint with it unless it's just portrait work. But lead paint will typically yellow, and we can see a little bit of yellowing in here. I don't know if some of this was intentionally done by Mary, or it looks to me like some of it's either yellow from the paint or yellow from the varnish that's on top of it. Not quite sure either way, but you can see the strokes. Let's take a look at some of these strokes. Here is really fascinating in this area because we can see there's darker color. That darker blue is underneath a lighter, like a very light blue, or she's put a lot of white back into it and gone over it almost with kind of a dry brush so that a little bit of that background blue shows through in spots. So that's really distinctive with impressionists and colorists will do that same thing too. And here, let's take a look at this young girl's hand. where we can see a lot of layering of color. Let's zoom in just a little bit. So again, you can see that Mary didn't paint this all in one sitting. There are several layers of paint. Okay, so let's take a look at this part of the painting. This is the hand, the girl's hand. And there's actually a lot to pull apart here. You can see that Mary took several sessions to get the skin tone correct and right, on, especially on the hand. And you can see there are different layers back and forth of a cooler color and then a warmer color. Let's take a look at that cooler color. It, to me, if we look at it with the color picker, it is sort of a dull purple, but it's lightened up with white, so it's not dark purple, obviously, but it is in kind of that purple end of the spectrum. Let's take a peek now at another area, and we can see that this color here, in what we would call a lighter area, it's a little bit warmer, it's a bit lighter, but it's still sort of purpley. But it does have a little bit more yellow and a little bit more pink in it, so it is warmer. And as we go up here, you can see Mary has put several layers on top. So she, I think, started off with this darker layer of kind of purple and red, very obviously light purple and into the reds here. So that's a little bit what we're seeing here. Again, it's purpley red. And then as we go up, it's going to get a little bit more dark and a little bit more purple. If we come over here onto this other thumb, on the thumb, we can see it's quite a bit warmer, more orange. And then what's really interesting is just this beautiful handling of the nail bed right here. And there's a little warm line on one side and a cool line on the other to indicate the nail bed. And that's about it. She didn't get too detailed with that, the end of that thumb. But it's very, very subtle. I mean, she did an amazing job here with this hand. What else is very subtle is the back fingers that are kind of twirled around the hair braid or the bundle of hair. And we can see that it's pretty loosely painted. It's very dark. It's definitely like a dark lavender color, with some highlights that are definitely in the red zone. And that's a pretty deep red, actually, that she's used there, but it's just that tiny little bit right there along the edge. She uses this color a little bit up here and a little over here as well. But those back fingers are quite simply painted, but that's deceptively simple. My guess is that she took a lot of time getting that just right. And then let's take a look at one more thing before we wrap up this discussion of girl arranging her hair. What I love about this is Mary went ahead and did some really strong darks here in the shadowy areas of this shirt or chemise. And that is probably not the way it really looked. There's a strong light here, probably from a window, and we can see a mirror here in the background. But it's very likely that the shadows here, Mary probably went a little bit darker with them than they appeared in life. But that was really, again, to support the whole painting. She really needed those darks in here to balance out all of the strength of the face area and the hands and the arms. So she did an amazing job with this piece. She did such a good job with it that it was exhibited at one of the salons in Paris, and Edgar Degas fell in love with the painting. He decided after seeing this that women actually could paint if they were given enough training, just like guys. But he loved this piece. He bought this painting and kept it with him until he died. It was one of his favorite pieces ever. So I hope you've learned a lot from today's discussion of girl arranging her hair. This painting is actually the digital version of this painting is available for download from the National Gallery of Art's website. because it's out of copyright. So you're welcome to download the full copy of this piece and study it in great detail on your own. There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot more that we could have discussed, but those are some of the key highlights that I wanted to talk about today. So thank you again so much, and we'll see you next time.